Breathtaking in ambition, NASA has now revealed its plans to develop a permanent lunar base. It is intended to be a launch pad for exploration and a testing ground for new technologies and space infrastructure.
4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition. And liftoff.
And it builds on the success of Artemis 2 in April.
Now bound for the moon.
Which took the 4 astronauts around the far side of the moon and was a critical evaluation of the Orion crew module. But the next set of missions bring far greater challenges, establishing a permanent outpost on the lunar surface.
We are leveraging the NASA playbook from the 1960s, figuring out what works and what doesn't in this epic science of survival, because the moon base is as beautiful as it is hostile. In sunlight, the surface can heat to over 250 degrees. In darkness, it can drop well below -200. There is no atmosphere to moderate these extremes, no protection from radiation and solar particle events.
The construction will start by 2029, and the plan is for a sustained presence by 2032. And this will be driven by private companies building landers and rovers, lunar drones, and constellations of satellites.
We are building humanity's first outpost beyond Earth. Through Artemis we are going, and with Moonbase, we're going to stay. We are creating a future where exploration is not just an incredible moment in history, but the first foothold beyond Earth for all of humanity.
But behind it all is superpower competition. For China is also aiming to build a lunar base, revealing these wildly futuristic-looking plans for a city on the moon. Whether these rival ideas ever get off the ground depends on sustained political commitment and vast amounts of funding. But NASA, dismissing skeptics, is declaring this a new golden age of exploration. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Well, as Robert says, we are heading into some very interesting times if you're a bit of a space geek, whether you're in the US, China, here in the UK, or anywhere else for that matter. Well, we are joined by Dr. Hannah Sargent, a planetary scientist and space expert at the University of Leicester. Thank you, Dr. Sargent, for joining us to talk about this. We heard a bit about some of the rivalries involved in the space programs at the moment. But we should say, aside from the US-China situation, there's a lot of other countries involved in this. We saw some involvement from Europe and Canada in the Artemis mission recently.
Yes. Going to space, going to the moon particularly, is going to be a global endeavour. So the US are definitely championing the Artemis missions, but they can't do it alone. And they've said that in a lot of their recent announcements for their moon plans. And we'll have a number of payloads going on board some upcoming lunar missions, even from the UK.
And what sort of things will that involve in practice?
So there's an instrument called the Prospect instrument, which is a European Space Agency payload, and from that, the one aspect of that is being built in the UK, and it's going to be looking for ice, water ice in the lunar polar regions, because that will be a really significant discovery, really, to sample that ice, understand the history of water in the solar system, and even use it to produce the critical resources we need for our moon bases one day.
And just to go back to that situation with China, how much of a rival is China to the United States? I'm hearing some people suggest that they could potentially set foot on the moon before NASA managed to.
Yes, I mean, it is undeniably a space race, and that is a good thing for development and growth when it comes to landing people on the moon and developing the key technologies to build a moon base and even head onwards to Mars. And it is obviously politically driven, but there are definitely some positives that can come from that. But, you know, no one is working alone. The Chinese will be working with some of their spacefaring allies as well. Yeah, I think the Chinese are on a really good track to land boots on the moon by the end of the decade, and the US are trying to push extremely hard to make that happen for the US beforehand. I don't know how achievable that may be, but they are definitely throwing everything they have at making it happen. But ultimately, it's going to happen whether the Chinese do it first or the US do it first. I don't think it ultimately matters, because it's not just about boots on the moon. It is building broader infrastructure for a large-scale moon base.
It does seem that that's a key part, because you look back to the Apollo missions and the space race between the Americans and the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and that was a big part of the Cold War battle between them. I mean, as a scientist, does it feel slightly sad in a way that we only seem to make progress in space exploration when there's a political reason to do it?
Yeah, it can be frustrating sometimes, because we think there's always a great reason to go to the moon and beyond. And actually, one of the downsides of the Apollo era was that once that we did have boots on the moon and they won, then funding really dropped, and subsequent Apollo missions were cancelled, and a lot of great science was missed out on. Whereas now, we're not repeating Apollo. We're going to the moon to stay. So that's why it's not just about boots on the ground. It is about building the rovers, the landers, and the larger infrastructure. And it's so that we can have this sustained presence, do long-term science, which is going to be so incredible for the scientific community. There is so much we can learn from having a more prolonged presence on the lunar surface, but we can also develop the technology and practice how to operate for long periods of time on the planetary surface, so that we can ultimately take that onwards to Mars and really expand our presence throughout the solar system.
We heard that quote from Jared Isaacman of NASA, saying that they're not going to abandon the moon again. And after 50 plus years, it's great to see this new interest in it. Do you believe that we're going to be in it for the long term now, despite any political changes that might happen?
Yes, I definitely do. So one of the fields that I work in quite closely is the utilization of space resources. So the idea of finding materials locally, harvesting them and using it to build your roads, your bases, and produce your rocket propellant and your life support needs. And that has been a huge focus of this effort around the world, because we realize that we can't just bring what we need, camp out for a few days and return home again. We need to be able to sustain ourselves for long periods of time. And so much of that we've learned from the International Space Station about how to operate for long periods of time. So this is part of a much larger plan about learning to live and operate in space. So it will be the space station, the moon, and then beyond.
It's an interesting point. The space station was a big collaboration between the Americans, the Russians, and other space agencies, and it felt like a real coming together of nations. Now we've got China launching their own or operating their own space station. The ISS has a finite life. Is there a kind of change that we're going away from that collaborative approach in some ways, and it's becoming a bit more of a rivalry?
Yeah, I really loved what the space station did for international relations. There were times when on the ground, these nations weren't friends, but they were forced to cooperate because they had astronauts working together in space. And so, yeah, there are aspects that can be quite frustrating about having these different approaches, these separate approaches, and sometimes conflicting approaches, and this could lead to issues on these planetary surfaces, because we agreed globally that we will not own land on the moon, and so we can't just stake a claim and get there first and say, well, you can't operate here. There is a lot of progress that needs to be made in terms of the policy side of things to understand how we are going to cooperate in space. But even now, recent Chinese missions, they obtained some samples from the lunar surface using robotic landers, and they've shared those with nations around the world. A number of teams here in the UK have had access to those samples to do scientific research. So science really does help maintain cooperation, even if politically there might not be that same level of cooperation.
Can I ask you a little bit about the details of what we might see going forward? Because we make big headlines about moon bases, but we're not going to see something out of a sci-fi film appear immediately. How is this going to play out over time?
Yeah, so both of these approaches are somewhat similar. Instead of having one giant base, one giant building, it's actually going to be this distributed sort of array of different assets. So your rovers, your landers, some small habitats. There is an aspect of we want to go and explore different areas, and for scientific reasons to make the most of different regions. There are some areas for example, in the polar regions at the top of craters, you have permanent sunlight, which is a great resource. We can use that for power. And in the base of craters, we think there are these icy deposits. But then at the equator, we might have better communication. So there's lots of different places to go and explore. So both of these leading sort of US and Chinese approaches are going to send a number. They're just accelerating the number of different assets that they're sending, and they will have increasing complexity. So we'll have some rovers. I think the US are going to send some hoppers, which would be interesting, with these little sort of propellers underneath. They've called them drones, but they don't have sort of helicopters. Blades, because there's no atmosphere. But yeah, so they'll be hopping to go explore. We're going to understand as much as we can. Then we'll send the bases, or the beginnings of bases, for humans to go and operate in, and then we'll send the infrastructure required to build roads and landing pads and various other things, and fuel ports to harvest oxygen to make rocket propellant. And so yeah, there's lots of elements that will be sent over the next few decades.
And that inevitably, people then start talking about the idea of making it to Mars, and there's a lot of people who are invested in this. How important of a step is this development of the moon in getting to Mars?
Yeah, the moon is really critical, actually. So we were really pleased to see this refocus towards the moon, because there was always this ambition of getting to Mars. But those of us who've been working in this sector, particularly in sort of space resources, we realize that we have to learn and develop things a lot closer to home. To get to Mars, it takes minimum 6 months, and then you've got to do your operations and return home. If something doesn't work, or if you don't have enough supplies, or something goes wrong, that is an extremely expensive mistake to make. So we have to be able to develop and prototype things a lot closer to home, and learn our lessons realistically. And also, the moon has a lot less gravity than here on Earth. And that means that it's actually a lot easier to launch rockets and supplies from the surface of the moon, and ultimately cheaper, because you don't technically need as bigger rockets. So we can actually use the moon as a sort of pit stop, and collect some of what we need from the moon before we head onwards to Mars.
I want to ask you finally, we talked about some of the international collaborations that are at play here, despite the rivalries. And we saw a couple of years ago Tim Peake make it to the International Space Station as a British astronaut. Is it possible that we could, with the relationships we have, we could be seeing a British astronaut on the surface of the moon within our lifetime?
I think within our lifetime, that's definitely something that's achievable and should be a goal. A lot of the way that international space operations and collaborations work is, we might offer something. So we might have technologies that we can offer, or capabilities, and trade that for spots for astronauts, or things like that. So we might not have our own capability to launch crew from the UK, but we can definitely cooperate with these different nations, and so that it's ultimately beneficial for all of us.
You'll be getting your application in soon.
Maybe not. Make ground control perhaps for me.
Well, it's been fantastic talking through some of the details. Dr. Hannah Sargent, thank you very much for being with us here at ITV News.